The term snake oil is one that I feel gets overused in this hobby. It's become sort of a catch-all to just describe anything that someone's skeptical about and just define it as being completely irrelevant and useless in an audio system. And so when I got a bunch of different products here that I thought might fit into that category where potentially some of them don't have any impact, I thought, why not pull them all together and do a snake oil extravaganza? Now, yes, I'm poking fun a little bit at the term snake oil. I don't agree with the term. I have come across products that I think are overpriced or don't have a great deal of impact on an audio system, but I've very rarely found anything that has no perceivable benefit at all. Sometimes it's purely ergonomics, sometimes it's very mild sonic changes, sometimes it's more significant sonic changes, but the point is I've rarely found something that does nothing at all. So yes, some products are overpriced, some products have minimal impact and therefore minimal value, and so for this video I thought let's have a look at some products that may or may not have any impact, or might just have very minimal impact and might not be worthwhile. Let's work out if there's any value in them, and then let's work out which ones I think are actually good value, and down to those that may be a little bit more questionable in terms of the sorts of things you might only do when you've got everything else in place. Before I jump into introducing these, there's one other thing that I think is really important to cover off here, and that is that if you've started watching this video and you're skeptical, you're questioning, or maybe you're really interested, it could go either way. If you've got any interest in the topic of this video at all, and you're in Melbourne, or you're going to be in Melbourne in August, then I've got an event planned where you could come and find out for yourself. The Passion for Sound Blind Listening event has been specifically set up to allow people like you to come along and listen to products like these. I'm not going to say which products are or are not actually in that. Some of these might be, none of them might be, I'm not going to say. But the point is that you can come along and use your own ears in a completely blind setup to work out if you can hear a difference. And so if you'd like to prove to yourself that these things make no difference, or you'd like to hear for yourself how much of a difference they make, whatever your angle is on it, check out the link in the description down below through to the blind listening event, come along and help me explore this a bit further, and then share some data back with the community. You'll be doing yourself a favour, and you'll be doing other people in the hobby a favour. So check out the link, book your tickets, and come along soon. Having said all that, let's now jump into talking about the 5 products. If you're just here to hear what I think about the impact of just one of them, then I've got chapter markers within the timeline down below here and also in the description, so you can click straight through to those. But let me tell you what we're going to be talking about today. We've got the Topping HS02. This is a USB isolator system. I'll explain what each of these does in detail when I get to the actual section on that product. And these are in no particular order, just as I pick them up. We've also got the original Uptone EtherRegen here. This is a network switch. We've got the Effect Audio Aries S8W wire. Now I've also got the original Aries bundle up in here to show you the difference between them and talk about them. This is an IEM cable. We've got a DC connection cable to go from a linear power supply through to an amplifier, a DAC, a streamer, etc. And then the final thing is we've got a USB reclocker device. This is the Gieseler Reinigen. I need to check that one. But as I said, this is a USB reclocker, takes USB input, reclocks the signal, and then sends it back out. And so let's jump in now and start with a look at the Topping HS02. This guy comes in at just $99 US. It's a very small little device. It's a very simple device on the outside. And as I said before, this is a USB isolator. So what this is intended to do is separate your source for your music, such as a PC, from your DAC that's receiving the signal. And the whole reason that you would use one of these is to basically remove noise from the power circuit. So this is not intended to actually improve the sound quality, so much as remove noise from the circuit. So ground loops, noise from, say, a GPU if you've got a computer that pumps out noise through the USB sockets, that's where you'd use one of these. It's USB 2.0 only if that makes a difference to you. And it will also allow you to feed a separate 5-volt power supply into the socket you're not using, and I'll explain how that works in a second. And so the idea is that if you need a separate 5-volt power supply, you can feed that in, but you could also just run it as I have, going from your computer into here, out of here, and then straight to whatever your DAC is. And as I said before, this makes no difference to the sound. It's not intended to. It's just going to remove noise coming through that power circuit. Before I tell you how it performed for me, let me quickly explain how it works. On one side, we've got a USB-B input and a USB-C input. On the other end, we've got a USB-A output and a USB-C output. On each end, there's a switch to tell the device which input or output you're using. So you could go USB-C in and USB-A out. You could go USB-B in and USB-C out, whatever combination you like. And then, as I mentioned before, if, for instance, you're using the USB-B input coming from, say, your PC, and the product you're using down the chain, you need the 5-volt power for, you can actually add in a 5-volt signal to the inactive input. So if you're using the USB-B for your signal, then you could feed a power supply, a 5-volt power supply like a phone charger, into the USB-C socket. Or of course flip that around. So as I said, this is a pretty simple device. When I first got it, I wasn't really sure how I was going to review it. I didn't have any problems in my system. Everything worked fine for me. I don't get any USB noise from my computer. Even from the generic motherboard sockets, I've got some optimized USB cards in there. But even from the basic USB sockets on the motherboard, I've never had problems. And then lo and behold, along came the FiiO SP3 speakers. I've got a review coming for those soon. And somewhere in the mix, I'm not blaming this on the SP3s, but somewhere in the mix, the combination of the SP3 speakers with, I think at the time I was using the Sound Blaster X5, the new Creative Sound Blaster X5, that's also coming up for review. I was using the Creative Sound Blaster X5 and the FiiO SP3 speakers. The speakers are using a wall wart style power supply. The Sound Blaster is powered directly from the computer. And for some reason, the combination of those ended up creating all sorts of noise through the Sound Blaster X5. Again, I'm not blaming either of these products. This is just one of those things that can happen when you have products that don't have their own earth. And so what tends to happen is that you get a circuit created for the noise to travel from the computer through the DAC, possibly out through the speakers, or possibly it just stays in the DAC and comes out wherever it wants to come out. And that's where a product like the HS2 theoretically should come in handy. And I have to say, it was absolutely brilliant. It went from being a system that was unlistenable, where there was crackles and noise coming through the speakers or headphones, whatever I plugged into the Creative X5, which by the way is down here, that's why I keep looking down there. And so the moment I plugged in the HS02 here, everything was fine. This perfectly isolated the noise. I had no more problems from there. I was able to record my recent review of the Antlion Kimura and the Rode NTH100M with no noise, no pops, no crackles, no problems. And so for $99 US, if you do have a noisy system, the Topping HS02 is an absolute winner. As I said, it is going to make zero difference to the sound quality. It has no impact on that at all. All it is doing is separating that 5-volt power supply, filtering it, taming it, providing a different external power supply if needed, and then passing it all on. So it's not altering the signal in any way, shape or form. It's not reclocking. It's not doing anything fancy. It's just isolating noise from the power. And for that, it works absolutely perfectly. So if you have a noisy USB system and you need to tidy it up, get yourself an HS02. It's brilliant. But now let's move on to another USB product in the Gieseler reclocker. The Gieseler Audio Reinigen here, and I've checked the pronunciation since I started the video, so it is Reinigen. The Gieseler Audio Reinigen is a USB reclocker. So what this is intended to do is take a USB signal coming in, make sure the clock and the timing accuracy of that signal is just right, and then send it back on its way. Theoretically, that should reduce jitter and improve the overall quality of the sound. The Reinigen retails for 1,695 Australian dollars, so that equates to just under 1,100 US dollars. The Reinigen works on a similar concept to something like the Inuos Phoenix, and the Phoenix retails for over 3,000 US dollars. So all of a sudden, this actually seems like, assuming it works, seems like it could be a really good value for money proposition. But of course, the big question then comes down to, does it actually make a difference? Is it of good quality in terms of the components used and the design used internally? Is it worth spending your money on, basically? Something else that this does that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is it also provides full isolation of your USB circuit. If you're familiar with DACs like some of the Cord DACs, the Qtest, the TT2, or the shit DACs such as the Bifrost 264 or the Yggdrasil, for instance, those have what's called galvanic isolation. And what that means is that you're basically separating any noise that could be coming in from the USB circuit on the computer or whatever the source is. You're separating that from the internal workings of the DAC. But not all DACs have that. So that's where a reclocker like this, and in this case also an isolator, that's where this can come into play. So in other words, what's happening is that the signal coming in, and let me show you the back of this again. The signal coming in here to the USB-B socket, that is in no way going to connect any of the circuitry in there to electrical noise coming from the source. It's all isolated so that no noise coming to this point can get further through the circuit. And so theoretically, what then comes out of the USB-A socket should be really clean and also with pristine timing. As a part of that process, what also is going on inside the Reinigen is that it also has low noise power supplies internally. And that's important because obviously you want low noise for any of the circuitry that's processing the signal. And then I'm also assuming that because a lot of DACs require the 5-volt power signal on the USB line, in order to isolate what's coming in, but then still give the DAC down the chain everything that it needs, I'm guessing it's also putting out a nice clean 5-volt signal. On top of that, for a reclocker, you obviously also need a really high quality clock. And when I was chatting to Clay from Gieseler Audio, one of the things that he spoke about was that I asked him why he hadn't gone down the path of using, say, an oven-controlled clock. And what he was talking about was the fact that the oven-controlled clocks, these are temperature-controlled, in other words, to make sure that there's very consistent timing. What he was talking about, though, with that was that when you use an oven-controlled clock, that's about long-term accuracy of the signal. So what it means is that you're going to have exactly the same performance when you first switch the unit on as you will in 3 hours' time. Maybe not when you first switch the unit on, but once it's warmed up in the first 5 minutes or so, the timing accuracy is still going to be the same 3 hours later, even if the room around it, the chassis of the device, has changed temperature. But as Clay pointed out, and this kind of makes sense, what's actually more important is that from one sample to the next, the phase noise is low, and by phase noise we mean timing noise. In other words, the variation from one moment to the next at the frequency at which you're measuring it and you're using it, that there's very, very minimal variation from those samples one to the next. And that's what Clay's focused on here. Now, of course, there are oven-controlled clocks that also have low phase noise, but they're going to shoot the price up really high. That might be why something like the Inuos Phoenix is a much higher price tag. But Clay made the choice to keep this at a cheaper price while still maintaining a very accurate clock that just might vary a little bit with temperature, but is more consistent from moment to moment, and that's what we need from music. And I don't mean more consistent than oven-controlled clocks. What I mean is more consistent than a clock with low phase noise. So whether it's oven-controlled, not oven-controlled, the key is the low phase noise, that sample-to-sample accuracy. That's what Clay focused on. The final spec that may or may not be important to you is that the Reinigen will do up to 480 megabits per second in terms of data transfer. That's going to be way more than you're ever going to need for music, so there should be no issues there. But depending on what you're using it with, and if you're doing high data transfer through here, if you wanted to connect it up to a computer, between say a computer and a server, I don't know why you might, but for instance, if you're in a situation like that where you also want data throughput, that could be a limiting factor. But this is really designed for audio, so I don't think 480 megabits per second is going to be an issue. And so all of this is really nice on paper, really nice in theory, but the big question for me, and maybe a little bit of skepticism from me, was whether or not it could actually make a big difference. This is one of those products where I really expected to come back and tell you that it has a minor impact and it just makes a small incremental improvement to the audio, and therefore is one of those things you should only buy if you've got everything else in place. But as always, I like to test before jumping to those conclusions, and so I did 2 different tests. First up, I connected the Reinigen to a generic USB output from my computer, so not one of the nice high quality JCAT ones, but just a standard motherboard connection. I tried it with that to the SPL Phonitor behind me, which uses an AKM DAC chip. It's a nice DAC, it's nothing special. And so I tried it with the same cable going initially direct from the computer to the Phonitor, and then that same cable connected into here, and then another generic cable out of here and into the Phonitor. Listening to Sideways by Sitters and Cope, and without the Reinigen in the system, I had no complaints at all. It sounded great. The DAC, as I said, in the Phonitor is nice. It's not amazing, but it's solid. And so I really didn't expect there to be a significant change. When I then connected up the Reinigen, I have to say the difference was significant. The soundstage was drastically improved, and I don't mean that it transformed it into a completely different sounding DAC and suddenly elevated it to the level of a Chord Hugo TT2, but my point is it was not even close. You could clearly hear the difference. There was a better sense of space between instruments, the soundstage felt larger, there was also a little bit more depth because there was more space around the sounds. And everything came across more refined as well. Tonality didn't change as such, but everything was easier to listen to, a little bit smoother in the sense of refinement, less harshness. So I wouldn't have said at the beginning that there was any harshness in the Phonitor, but once you hear it with the Reinigen connected, you can hear that there is a little bit getting through. And that's not a knock on the phonitor, it's more a case that USB audio is prone to transmitting noise through the cables. And that's particularly true because as far as I know, the USB input on the phonitor isn't galvanically isolated. And so theoretically, you've got two benefits coming from the Reinigen in that it should be improving the accuracy of the timing of the signal and also isolating any of that noise that would otherwise be getting into the DAC circuit in the phonitor. So that led me to my second test, which was to think, is this of any value if you've got one of those DACs that is already galvanically isolated? And so I fired up the exact same type of test using a direct connection from the stock motherboard USB outputs into the shit Gieseler OG, and then adding in the Reinigen into that circuit. And what I heard was a lesser degree of improvement. It was still an improvement, there was no doubt about it, but it wasn't as significant a shift. And so I think in both cases I'd say that it is worthwhile, but it's particularly worthwhile if you have a DAC that is not galvanically isolated. That's where the Reinigen is going to have major impact. If you've got a DAC like a Bifrost 2, like a shit Yggdrasil, a Chord Cutest, any of those, if you have a DAC that you know is galvanically isolated, this is still going to be a nice addition, but it won't be quite as big of an impact as if you have a non-isolated DAC. And so for about 1,700 Australian dollars, about 1,100 US dollars that works out to be, I do think that the Reinigen is a good addition. It's an impactful addition to the sound, but it's also one of those that is not the first thing you should rush out and do because of the price tag. And so you'll see at the end, I'm going to rank these in terms of how I think their impact stacks up to their price tag. I do think the Reinigen is a good product and it is worthwhile, but we'll wait to see where it ranks in the scheme of things as to which tweaks you should do first versus which tweaks you should hold off on. And so with that said, let's move to our third tweak. And now we're getting into sketchy territories with DC cables. I didn't expect the DC connection cable to have a big impact. And that's because the power coming from a linear power supply is DC, direct current. And that means that it is one consistent current all the time. That's as opposed to alternating currents, which is what we're used to seeing coming from mains power, but it's also what carries our signals through coaxial cables, USB cables, it's what goes in interconnects, and also in headphone and speaker cables. And so in alternating current, because that voltage is fluctuating, the way the cable or the wire reacts to those fluctuating voltages, that's really where I've always understood the impact to be from cables. And so when you take away that alternating or fluctuating voltage, I wasn't sure this was going to have any impact. So I have to say I came into this one pretty skeptical. Curious Cables sent me out a couple of these, the only difference being the different barrel diameters for the connection into the devices. And these come in at about $240 US, depending on the length that you need. Obviously, as you go longer, the price does go up in incremental steps, but we're starting at $240 US. And so this is designed, and it will of course vary depending on the linear power supply you're using, but this is designed so that you've got a connector at one end, which is going to come from your linear power supply. In my case, I've got the 3-pin XLR for my Gieseler audio power supplies that I use. And then at the other end, it's generally going to be something like a barrel connector like this one, or possibly in some cases you might have various DIN plugs. Other than that, there'll no doubt be a special recipe going on inside this one to maximize things like noise rejection, the carrying of the current through here and the voltage through here. And so beyond that, it really just comes down to how they sound. I fired up The Preacher by Harry Connick Jr. from the Smokey Mary album. Now this one's really hard to find. It's not on a lot of streaming services, but it is an absolute brilliant album, so check it out if you can get your hands on it. This is more of a funk album from Harry Connick rather than the smoother jazz that some people know him for. But if you can get your hands on Smokey Mary, I think it's a brilliant listen. And so I fired up The Preacher from that album, and I was listening through the Gieseler Labs A3 Pro amp, which takes a 12-volt DC input, and I was comparing the sound using my Gieseler Audio linear power supply and its stock cable, and then switching over to the Curious DC cable instead. And as per my skepticism, I have to say there wasn't a lot of difference. But there was a little bit. I have no way of explaining how it's there. I'm guessing it's maybe rejecting environmental noise and preventing that from getting through, but it was a fairly subtle difference. When I removed the Curious cable and went back to the stock cable from the linear power supply, I feel like the sound got just a little bit flatter. It was still a lovely sound, there were no issues with it, but there was just a tiny bit more sort of depth in the sound and space in the sound when using the Curious cable. It was very, very subtle, I can't stress that enough. This is not a big shift, but there was a difference, there was an improvement. I also think the sense of refinement, the sense of, again, that sort of smoothness, a bit like what I spoke about with the reclocker, I think very similarly, but to a less degree, the same is true with the DC cable. The sounds don't lose any resolution, they don't change tonality, but everything's just a bit easier to listen to, a little bit smoother sounding overall. But the differences are very subtle. I'm a huge fan of Curious cables, their USB cables, their interconnects. They're what I use as kind of my standard cable across my system. But I have to say on this one, I'm less impressed. I'm not saying they don't do a good job. They definitely did make a difference. But for $240 odd US for a pretty short length of cable, this is one of those where I'd say I would only do this if everything else in the system is in place. Having said that, I also spoke to Rob Woodland from Curious about this. And when I raised my concerns that they don't do as much, and I asked him about why a DC cable could even have an impact, one of the key things he said as the conversation unfolded was he talked about the fact that, in his experience, the linear power supply that you connect it to will also make a difference. And so I'm guessing that means that some will have more impact, some will have less impact depending on the cable. I don't know where the Gieseler power supplies sit in the scheme of things. They're the only linear power supplies that I've got here. And so the end conclusion does remain the same, which is I would only go for one of these if everything else is in place. Or maybe if you're investing in a really high quality linear power supply for a really high end system, then that's probably where it does make sense to put a small percentage of your expenses into one of these cables. But that's really about it. Beyond that, I would say that they're just an incremental shift and not one that I would rush out and spend money on. And so let's move on now to our next one, and that's going to be the Effect Audio Aries S, and specifically the 8W version. Now let me separate these here and I'll talk about them. What I've got here is the original Aries S cable. I reviewed this some time ago on the channel. It's a $179 US upgrade cable for your IEMs, and I really like it. It's a lovely cable, it's ergonomically nice, it's not crazily expensive, and it's a decent upgrade to your sound. Moving to the 8W, and what this means is you're going from a 4-wire weave to an 8-wire weave here. So we've got twice as many wires, twice as much surface area, twice as much copper, all carrying your signal. So this is a heavier gauge cable you can see here. It's in this beautiful, what I sometimes call like a square braid. It's braided in such a way that the final finished product comes into more of a square profile. It feels great. It looks great. The price for this, by the way, is $279 US. So it's $100 US more than the standard cable. And for that money, what you're getting is a cable that it's heavier, it's a little bit stiffer, but it actually feels great. In some ways, I almost like the way this drapes and hangs from an ergonomics point of view better than the standard cable. It's a bit more kind of direct or assertive in how it hangs. That's a kind of funny way to describe it, but I actually really liked using this one. I kind of enjoyed it more than the Aries, and the Aries is already great, but the 8W is even better. But of course, you're not going to spend $100 just because it looks and feels better if it doesn't do anything for the sound. And the good news is that it actually does. It's basically giving you everything that the standard Aries wire does, which is a lovely smooth, natural tonality, lots of detail, lots of resolution sound. It takes that and it just ups all of it. The sound all has a bit more weight with the 8-wire. And what I mean by weight, and this has got nothing to do with the fact that it's heavier to hold and feel, the point is that all of the music has more presence, more body to it. It's like the music is fuller sounding. The tonality is completely unchanged. It's just like, it's really hard to describe. It's like there's a little bit more, or maybe a little bit less decay coming through, and that's not actually what's going on, but it sounds a little bit like that, where the music just has more presence and more body. I tested this across a couple of IEMs and it was the same regardless. So I think from memory I used the Prestige and the Monarch Mark II from T Audio as two of the options. I also played with this wire when I was reviewing the Canera Nana Z Tune Edition. And then the other thing that it did was it helped to separate the sounds a bit more as well. It just pulled apart the audio a bit more. It gave me more space between the instruments and the vocals. And so as I said, it's really just like taking the standard Aries S, which I already like, and improving all of it in very clear and obvious ways. It wasn't a subtle shift. It wasn't one of those where I had to go back 3 or 4 times to find the difference. It was there. It was very obvious. Now, if $100 US is a stretch, I don't think it's worth stretching for this improvement. I think the standard Aries cable is fantastic. But if you can go from $179 to $279, this is a really lovely premium cable, both in terms of ergonomics, but also in its sound. So this one is an easy recommendation, but I'm not going to tell you yet where it ranks. We'll get to that at the end. And so that brings me around to my final tweak, and this one's possibly going to be the most controversial, and that's the Uptone EtherRegen here. Now, this is the original EtherRegen. This is getting really old now. I don't think you can actually buy them anymore. I think there is a version 2 coming, but it's not yet released. But either way, this was something that I picked up from a patron because it was something that I wanted to try out for myself. And so the idea of this is it's a network switch or a LAN switch. You've got the 4 regular sockets over here for your regular RJ45 connections, inputs, outputs, etc. And then on the other end, you've also got an isolated output, which is a dedicated audio type output. Now there's probably some features in here that I haven't tested. I think the socket on this side might be for optical type setups if you're using optical for your LAN. There's also an external clock functionality there, which I didn't get into testing in detail. I don't know if it was working the way I wanted it to. I did connect it up and give it a try, but I was having a few issues. So I'm not going to try and review it for that. What I was really curious about here was whether or not a network switch can make any difference. So whether it's the EtherRegen or another brand, can an audiophile network switch actually make a difference? I know this is a very hotly debated topic. It's caused some challenges and some conversations on the Patreon Discord server, the Passion for Sound Discord server. And so I figured the best way was to find out for myself. By the way, these retail or retailed for $640 US. So they're not a cheap edition, but they're not crazy expensive in the scheme of things. And as I understand it, what they're intended to do when we start talking about this isolated switch here, what they're really intended to do is basically just, again, isolate noise. They're going to improve the switching timing of the signal with any sort of reclocking that's going on inside. So they're kind of the same as the Reinigen here, but they're doing it for your network. For this test, I was listening to Life is a Long Song by Jethro Tull, and as I went back and forth, as I said before, using the isolated connection there, going from the isolated connection to a non-isolated connection, there was a clear and obvious difference. And by the way, I should mention here that I was using the Gustard R26 DAC with its inbuilt streaming LAN card, and so what I was doing was changing the wire connected to that from a wire connected to the isolated switch and a non-isolated switch over here. As I went back and forth between the isolated and non-isolated, what I heard consistently was that going to a non-isolated switch, the sound was getting a little bit thinner, and the overall feeling of it was sharper as well. It was a little bit harsher to listen to. Moving over to the isolated switch, things were smoother. This is becoming a bit of a common theme in what we're talking about today. Things got smoother, things got more separated once again. And this is one of those interesting cases where some people might hear the sound from the non-isolated switch and think of it as being more detailed, more clarity focused, because it's got that thinner, slightly more attacking sound. So it does seem to enhance the detail, but the fact that it's actually more fatiguing and a little bit more aggressive sounding, that's generally a sign that what you're actually hearing is noise, and that noise can make the sound a bit more aggressive, a bit more attacking, and therefore make you feel like you're hearing more details when actually what it's doing is it's just making things harsher. Definitely for me, as I went back and forth between the isolated and the non-isolated connection across a whole range of tracks, what I found was that I was definitely enjoying the isolated switch a lot more. It was more relaxing, more enjoyable. The separation was better, and that for me is always an excellent sign of a better quality connection, is it's better separating all the sounds because there's not noise kind of muddying up the space in between. And so this one kind of surprised me as well, that it made a really significant difference. That's probably then a nice time to move into the final rankings of which one of these I think works better or worse. But before I get there, the key thing I want to say is that nothing I've tried here ended up being snake oil. Everything had an impact, albeit questionable or very limited impact in some cases. Not questionable in the sense that it was clear that there was an impact, but questionable in terms of whether it's worth spending the money. That's a fair and reasonable question, and I encourage people to ask it and to challenge that value for yourself. But there was no doubt that it did change the sound, and that was really what this was about. I was looking to see if anything here was irrelevant, if you were paying for nothing at all, and you absolutely weren't in any of these cases. So let me rank for you now how I feel like these shook out in the end. The first thing I'll mention is that the Topping HS02, I'm not really going to rank in here. This is not about improving your audio with an audio tweak. This is about fixing a problem. And it absolutely does that. It does it perfectly. It does it beautifully. It does it simply and very affordably. So this just stands off on its own as a really great solution if you have USB noise problems. And by the way, I'll put links down below. If you need something like this, check out the links. Go grab yourself one. It works brilliantly. But from there, with the other four products that we've got, I think in terms of the most impact that I heard, the highest impact for me was definitely the Gieseler Reinigen. It was a big step forward in sound quality, that sense of separation, that sense of detail, clarity, refinement. It was all improved with the Reinigen in the circuit. The other thing that I really liked is it's going to connect up to any USB circuit. There's no drivers involved. You just plug your source into the Reinigen, you take a lead out of the Reinigen, into your DAC, and away you go, no matter what the source is, no matter what the DAC is. And so from that point of view, it's very versatile. You can buy it now for your current system and use it on anything you choose to buy in the future. The next most impactful thing that I tried, I would say, was the EtherRegen. Now obviously it's going to be fairly limited into where you can use it. It's going to sit behind the Reinigen for that reason. And that's because it's really only going to help you if you're streaming audio. If you've got an audio device that is pulling information through a LAN connection, the EtherRegen is brilliant, and in that situation, it's obviously more valuable than the Reinigen. But the Reinigen won out for me because USB is a more ubiquitous connection in many cases. Whether it's coming from PC, or a streamer, a smartphone, or a tablet, all of those are using USB, and that's where the Reinigen works. Whereas the EtherRegen is really only going to work if you've got a streamer taking a LAN input, or maybe on a PC if you're taking a LAN input into the PC and then spitting it out elsewhere. Now, I haven't tested the PC thing in depth. That was going to be a much bigger test than I could actually put my time to now. But if I can get my hands on an EtherRegen 2, I'll be glad to test it as a downchain system option for, say, a PC system, where you might have your network cable coming into the EtherRegen, out of the EtherRegen, into a PC, and then from a PC off to a DAC. I'd be really curious to see that one, so let's see if I can get my hands on an EtherRegen 2 or a competitor brand, and we'll try that in the future. For anyone following along, you probably already know where I'm going next, and that is to the Effect Audio Aries S8W cable. That's a bit of a mouthful. And that's because, again, I think it is a very good upgrade. For the price, I think it's a really good impact on the sound. It's $100 more, which is a big jump in terms of the starting price of $179. But the impact you're getting is significant for only $279, which in the scheme of things, when we're talking about $700 and over $1,000 products, in the scheme of things, this is one of the cheaper upgrades here, but it is only going to help you with IEMs. So it's a bit more of a targeted and focused tweak, but it's one that I think is worthwhile. I think it's a lovely cable for a pretty good price. And then finally, that leaves me with the curious DC cable here. I think this is of minimal impact. I've already said that. It definitely does make an impact. But at $240 plus US, I think it's one of those you should only do, as I said before, if you've done everything else in your system. That's when this could make sense, but before that, put your money into other areas, I think. And so at this point, to draw some final conclusions here, what I would say is that in this roundup that I've done here, there is no snake oil. That doesn't mean there's no snake oil anywhere in the hobby. Sadly, there are a few unscrupulous people that are selling very basic things that have been rebranded or kind of touched up to look fancy, and they're really not doing what they're saying they're doing. But that doesn't mean that everything that we have skepticism about is automatically snake oil. These products on my desk are a great example of that. And as I said before, if you want to come along and check out some of these sorts of tweaks for yourself, and again, I'm not saying any of these are going to be in the test. In fact, I don't think any of them are from what I've planned. I can't remember now. But the point is, if you want to come along and test some of these things out, hear them for yourself, then absolutely check out the link in the description below through to the blind listening event here in Melbourne early in August. I hope to see some of you there. There are limited tickets, so make sure you book soon. And then the final thing I'd say is that all of these sorts of tweaks, to me, seem to have some merit. You need to do your research as to which ones of these you buy, because there'll be other brands of reclockers, there'll be other network switches, other cables, etc. You need to check out reviews and impressions of each individual brand. But all of these can and do have an impact on the sound, and that was really the key for what I wanted to look into. So I hope you found this video useful, helpful, or informative. Hopefully I've inspired you to go out and check some of this stuff out for yourself if it's something you've been interested in. And as always, if you have found the video useful, helpful, or informative, I'd love it if you hit the like button. And also please subscribe if you haven't already and ring the notification bell. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.